Hello, Star Wars fans. Today, I'm going to compare George Lucas to Kathleen Kennedy on their handling of Lucasfilm and try to point out their differences. And since Kathleen Kennedy has only worked on Star Wars while she's been president, it only seems fair to compare her efforts to George Lucas's own handling of Star Wars. And by the way, I'd like to thank Azia Extreme Infinity for the video topic. We'll start with George Lucas, since he created Lucasfilm. First off, let's start with their agenda as head of Lucasfilm. George Lucas created Lucasfilm with the goal of making movies without studio executives tampering with his projects and to keep making them. Kathleen Kennedy's goal should have been to either maintain or grow the Star Wars franchise, because she has a boss to answer to over at Disney. Now let's briefly cover how they handled the Star Wars story and characters. Star Wars was George Lucas's personal brainchild, so he did not have to organize a story group to curate the universe. People would run their storylines and characters by him, and he would be the judge of what appeared in the books, games, comics, and movies. And when Star Wars was sold to Disney, he provided scripts for a sequel trilogy. And the Star Wars brand was able to expand in size and scope with characters and storylines he did not design or imagine himself. Kathleen Kennedy, on the other hand, had no choice but to create a story group. This was a good idea because it's become apparent that she's not a huge fan of Star Wars. However, she implemented this idea poorly by hiring the leader of the story group based on her personal politics. Because she is a feminist, Kathleen Kennedy decided that what was between her employees' legs was more important than choosing what was best for Star Wars. And under her control, Lucasfilm abandoned its expanded universe. The expanded universe being every bit of story and characters established in Star Wars novels, comics, and video games prior to Disney taking over. She also threw away the scripts provided by George Lucas for the sequel trilogy. All of this would have been fine if the story group had replaced all that thrown out content with new content, but they have failed to do so. And instead, it seems the Star Wars universe is shrinking and shrinking, with notable characters dying and no new characters standing out to take their place. Moving on, let's talk about their director situation. For George Lucas, it wasn't completely necessary for him to hire directors, since he was fully capable of directing. And during the filming of Return of the Jedi, when he hired director Richard Marquand, who wasn't fully capable of utilizing Lucasfilm special effects, he was able to step in and help. He did not second guess the man he hired, and lended a helping hand as needed. Kathleen Kennedy isn't a director, and because she isn't a director, she has to hire them. However, whenever she had an issue with the vision of the directors she hired, she got rid of them due to creative differences. And this happened 3 times. Colin Trevorrow with Episode 9, Lord and Miller with Solo, and Josh Trank with a Boba Fett movie. Essentially, it was her way or the highway, which also wasted money on hirings and reshoots. Why couldn't she figure out their creative differences before she hired them? Basically, Kathleen Kennedy proved incompetent when it came to hiring directors. Next, the movies. This is the important part. George has the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy under his belt, while Kathleen has 2 parts of a trilogy and 2 side stories under hers. Star Wars, the movie that started it all, made $775 million worldwide. Its sequel, The Empire Strikes Back, made $538 million, a decline of 31%. And the final movie to complete the original trilogy was Return of the Jedi, which earned $475 million, a further decline of 12%. So we can see that despite the beloved status of the original trilogies, that the ticket sales did trend downward. Then looking at the start of the prequels, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, earned over $1 billion worldwide. Its sequel, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, made only $649 million, a decline of 37%. And the last movie of the prequels, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, earned $848 million, an uptick of 30%. Despite the bumpy ride, every single movie made profit. And in the context of George Lucas's goal to keep making movies without studio interference, that profit allowed Lucasfilm to keep chugging along. He achieved his goal with every single Star Wars movie. Now the worldwide numbers of Disney's version of Star Wars. And since the excuse for Rogue One making half the money of The Force Awakens was that Rogue One was a side story and shouldn't be compared to a numbered episode, I'll be comparing numbered episodes to numbered episodes and side stories to side stories. Episode 7, The Force Awakens, made $2 billion. Episode 8, The Last Jedi, had a decrease of 36% when it made $1.3 billion. As for the side stories, Rogue One made $1 billion. The second side story, Solo, made $392 million, which was a 63% decrease, and the first Star Wars movie that lost money. Not only did it lose money, it bombed hard. You might say, but SolidStuff, it's just one bomb, and George Lucas's movies tended to trend downwards as well. It's the same outcome, right? If you only look at the numbers, sure. But if you look at the context of those numbers, the outcome is completely different. George didn't need to meet expectations because he was his own boss. Kathleen Kennedy doesn't have that freedom. She was to maintain or grow the brand. Because Disney is creating a Star Wars theme park based on the new movies. Because Disney is creating a new streaming service of which Star Wars was supposed to be one of the pillars. Because the Star Wars toy licensing fee that Hasbro paid $200 million for is about to be renegotiated, and bad movies with forgettable characters don't tend to lead to awesome figurines that children or collectors want. And before I move on from the worldwide figures, there are some important numbers I didn't cover. Important numbers that trended upwards. The ones concerning the future largest film market, China. If we look to the prequels by George Lucas, ticket sales went up, starting with 4.1 million with Episode 1, 5.4 million with Episode 2, and 9.1 million by Episode 3. Yet under Kathleen Kennedy, each Star Wars release earned less and less, to the point where Chinese theaters had completely pulled The Last Jedi from every single screen in under 2 weeks. Episode 7 started at 124.1 million. Rogue One followed it for 69.4 million. Episode 8, The Last Jedi, followed with 42.5 million. And Solo ended with 16.4 million. There is a reason for the discrepancy. Chinese people are incredibly resistant to Western ideologies of multiculturalism, political correctness, and positive discrimination. They even have a derogatory term for it, Baizo. The Chinese audience goes to the movies to see beautiful people and crazy effects. The prequels had those things. Disney Star Wars has the crazy visuals, but lack the beautiful actors, and has the politics they don't enjoy. Finally, moving on from the numbers, Kathleen Kennedy made a few decisions that affected the movies as well. First, she allowed Rian Johnson to toss out the sequel trilogy blueprint outlined by J.J. Abrams, which has resulted in the poor cohesion between Episodes 7 and 8 and the current downward spiral of the Star Wars brand. And secondly, she negotiated for an extra 10% domestic box office cut for The Last Jedi after the $2 billion success of The Force Awakens, an extra cut which she has probably lost for Disney after Solo bombed. Alright, time to talk about how they handle the heat, the criticism. George Lucas came under a lot of fire for the prequels. Poor dialogue, poor pacing, and one hateable character. And the fans weren't happy after The Phantom Menace. They hated Jar Jar Binks, so George reduced that character's screen time, despite him saying that it was his favorite character. He listened to the criticism, and he acted on it. He also hired a director to help him with Attack of the Clones. That experiment turned out badly, but he still listened to criticism and acted on it. and after the prequel backlash, he sold Lucasfilm rather than make another Star Wars movie. As for Kathleen Kennedy's handling of the criticism, she ghosted completely after the criticism of The Last Jedi. The only public appearance she's had since The Last Jedi was for the premiere of Solo. So she's only appeared once in the last 9 to 10 months. It's very unprofessional to not take responsibility for the direction Disney Star Wars has taken at this point. And speaking of professionalism, let's talk about their employee hires. George Lucas was on the cutting edge of special effects when it came to Star Wars, so he hired the best people he could find in the industries that he required. Kathleen Kennedy focused on hiring women due to being a feminist. This led to her hiring amateurs for the story group. How amateur, you might ask? Well, if you research their work history on IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, it's embarrassing. Luckily, other people have looked into their background, and I am going to circle relevant parts of their research. Carrie Hart, the head of the Star Wars story group, wrote 2 television episodes in 2003, 9 years before being hired by Kathleen Kennedy. She had 0 experience with Star Wars. Rain Roberts was an assistant to someone on the movie Life as We Know It, and associate producer for a 2008 documentary called The Fair Trade. Carrie Beck was an executive producer for a made-for-TV movie called Ghosts/Aliens. Diana Williams has no experience listed. Leland Chee was a game tester on a Star Wars game and worked in Lucasfilm licensing in 2006. Pablo Hidalgo was an uncredited visual artist on 3 projects between 1999 and 2000, and then played an uncredited extra in Revenge of the Sith. Matt Martin has 0 experience listed before the story group. Stephen Blank also has no experience listed. James Wogg has no experience listed. Josh Rhimes worked as a producer for 2 movies, BoJack Horseman and The Booth at the End, and worked as a production secretary for Curb Your Enthusiasm and a series called Smith in the 2000s. He also wrote 1 television episode in 2006. Stephen Feder has no experience listed. Carol Pardo played herself on the Star Wars After Show and an extra on the Star Wars show. That's the entire story group. The group handling what was once the largest movie franchise in history and the $4 billion investment by Disney has a sum of 3 television episodes in the 2000s as writing credentials. Why would Kathleen Kennedy hire such inexperienced people? It's because her feminist ideology got in the way. Her focus was to hire women first, male feminists second, with 0 consideration for Star Wars. If you want to look at their experience yourself, I'll put a link down below to the research that has been done on the topic by others. And because George hired professionals, that's why they didn't utter a negative peep about the fanbase on social media. Yet Kathleen Kennedy's amateurs have frequently attacked the Star Wars fanbase as sexist, toxic, and uneducated. And then there's the streaming. George didn't have to worry about this, but one of the reasons Disney bought Star Wars was for their future streaming service. And Kathleen Kennedy sold the Star Wars broadcasting rights to Turner Broadcasting, which means Disney can't stream a single Star Wars movie that came out before 2019. Not until 2024. The prequels, the original trilogy, or even the movies they've released thus far. She screwed the pooch for Disney. George Lucas wanted to tell a story with his trilogy. Kathleen Kennedy wanted to sell an ideology. And in the end, George walked away with $4 billion, while Kathleen Kennedy, by my calculations, has underperformed Disney's expectations by $4 billion. I think it's fair to say that George Lucas handled Lucasfilm leagues better than Kathleen Kennedy. He achieved his goal of making movies without studio interference and made money. Kathleen Kennedy, on the other hand, is reportedly getting the boot for failing her goal of maintaining or growing the Star Wars brand. The results speak for themselves. If you made it this far, let me know if you think I missed anything in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and
may the Force be with you.